We have with us today Maria Snegovaya. She's a senior fellow at CSIS, Center for International Strategic Studies, a very prestigious think tank in Washington, D.C. She's also professor at Georgetown University, a place of which I have fond memories because it's also my alma mater. I was a Fulbright there, so nice memories. But let's go directly to our subject, which is Russia, of course. There's a big interest in Russian affairs here in our region. And I want to ask you, Maria, the first question would be about the Russian public opinion. What is interesting? You are an expert in this. What is interesting to say about trends or variations between big cities, regions in the Russian public opinion? How do Russians, ordinary Russians, perceive this reality of war in Ukraine?
Great questions, and thank you very much for having me on the podcast. So I published a report devoted to studies of Russian public opinion last December, in December 2024, where I dispel many of the common misconceptions about how reliable the polling in Russia is. I'm sure you've seen and heard a lot of the claims that you cannot trust public opinion data in autocracies, in Russia in particular. Having said that, I summed up in that report a lot of scholarship and other expert analysis that has been done on Russian public opinion, specifically looking at the distortions in the polls since the start of the war, previous historical patterns that would be suggestive of some problems. And all of them point to the same direction, to the extent that you trusted Russian polling data before February 2022, you can trust them after. The evidence of preference falsification, to the extent that it exists at all, is no more than maybe 10% of all the data, which still at the level of approximately 75% approval of the war among the Russians gives you a majority of the war approval, and that is not unlike what we have seen before. Syria war in 2015, Russia's first war in Ukraine 2014, Russia's war in Georgia 2008, etc. More or less every single time Putin started a war, Russian public rallies around it, which also obviously suggests a lot of deeper issues within the Russian society going beyond just Putin alone. So it's not just about Putin. Unfortunately, it would have been easy to blame it all on him, but clearly there is more to the story than just him.
To your question, if I can stop you here just for one moment. So what you say is that polls are reliable in a way if you know how to read them. So, but can you explain a bit how come? I mean, Russia is an autocratic state. We hear these stories that people are repressed, they are under pressure, they fear. So how can you carry out a good opinion poll in Russia today?
Well, first of all, you can study public opinion data in autocracies. There's a lot of studies done in China, even in Iran, in multiple autocracies. You probably approach the public opinion, the notion of what public opinion is, differently there. But the general idea that you cannot study public opinion in autocracy is false. You can, and many studies do that. That's the first point. Second, even during the times when Russia was not an autocracy, in early 2000s, for example, the response to the wars that Putin started, remember the second war in Chechnya, then 1999, that was more or less the same. So we can see a pattern there that's very similar today that goes beyond the period when Russia was an autocracy. And remember in 2014, when the Crimean annexation happened and the first war in Ukraine launched by Russia, there was very much the same patterns of the Russian public opinion back then. Most importantly, the problem is that we in the West keep hearing voices, and very courageous, admirable voices of people who oppose the regime. But those are very few. They're minority as opposed to the rest of the Russian society. The share of the consistent Russian liberals, pro-Western liberals in the Russian society is about 7%. If you add people who are like maybe less consistent, like they like something about Putin, but maybe not other things, it's about 15%. And we know that the total war position in various polls is about 20%, which is about the same number. This 20% include, I want to flag for our listeners, not just consistent pro-Western liberals, but also people who may share all sorts of views about Russian politics, but they just don't like the war for different reasons. For example, they're typically worse off economically, and they think correctly that the state could have spent this money on perhaps better causes. So this is the 20% opposition to the war is not all of the, it does not necessarily embraces the liberals, pro-Western liberals. The share of actual pro-Western groups are much smaller, and that's a result of various factors. Russia historically lacked consistent pro-Western strong core of support. The share of even the Russian pro-Western parties in the early 1990s would actually gather about 15-20% of the votes in various elections. Plus, on top of that, many people escape. Many people who actually support these ideas.
The rest of the 80%. So do you see shades of gray there? Can you summarize what the situation is in this, in the other 80%?
And yes, and to a question also about the center and the regions. So in the rest of the 80%, the real imperialist, Girkin, Shelkov-Girkin style, hardcore supporters of aggression are also few. It's about 15%, so-called hawks. The absolute majority of the society is composed of people who are like more conformist. They don't have very well developed specified views, and they go with the flow, typically whatever the flow is in the status quo is in the current moment. Current status quo is the aggression, and so they side with it, even if maybe the war wouldn't have been their first preference. If you remember the polls before the war started, there was actually not a lot of support for the aggression, but they will embrace and they will green light whatever the Kremlin is doing at the moment. It's sort of the attitude, because the people don't feel like they have agency or any say in these matters. They believe Putin and the Russian politicians are professionals, and they get to decide what to do in foreign policy field. It's like the weather for them. Basically, if there's a thunderstorm, you don't, accuse or debate the thunderstorm. You sort of adjust. That's the sort of the feel.
So it's totally external. Politics and the business of the state is something external to their identity or mind.
Exactly.
Or whatever.
In a broader sense, it's just not a civil society. The people don't feel it or don't even think about having agency, and obviously they don't act on that. That's why one of the reasons why Putin was consistently successful, right, is that he understood this about the Russian society, and it will take years and years and years until the society will hopefully eventually emerge, go towards like embracing most of the civic ideas and patterns of behavior, but the majority are not there yet. The repressed minority who you hear about in the news, right, the foreign agents, the undesirables, the so-called extremists, all these and courageous, brave people, many of them are in jail these days. They are unfortunately a deviation from these groups, and they historically have been a minority. They still are a minority, especially in the context of the repressions. So in that sense, the trends have not changed. To your question about the capitals and the region, historically, St. Petersburg and Moscow, two of the largest cities of Russia, they are more opposition, pro-Western leaning. The geographic location, the exposure to various information sources, interacting with people with experiences living abroad and whatnot. So that has been historically true, while the regions have been more conservative, reactionary. It's also partly the economic structures. There are more businessmen who are less dependent on the state, typically in big cities, and in the regions, lower scale size cities, you are more dependent on state-offered enterprises. Having said that, over the last years, we have seen that the state was very successfully co-opting the remaining groups, even in the capitals. There are few opportunities to do independent business now. So one way or another, people are more dependent on the state, and that imposes some sort of, again, the need to acquiesce with adjust to the new status quo. And so even Moscow recently has been coming out actually quite in support in the polls, quite in support of the aggression, which is of course an unfortunate dynamic. The regime over the last 3 years has been quite successful, basically co-opting the groups who were originally unhappy with the start of the war, in an effort to sustain this new status quo that emerged in the last 3 years.
Okay, so if so many people are conformist, as you described them, especially in the region, but not only, does it mean that at some point, if by some miracle, the elite, the state becomes a little bit more liberal and democratic, they will follow the trend as well?
As we have seen in the 1990s, indeed, remember when Yeltsin was Russian president, or even earlier Gorbachev, when the reform started, it sort of created this avalanche effect, snowball effect, where a lot of grievances that were previously suppressed were now expressed. And since the status quo was changing, people started speaking up more openly and sort of joining in this change. But that only happened when even the Russian elites realized the unsustainability of the previous status quo under Gorbachev. And I think it will help us a lot if we factor in the role of the elites, of the Soviet elites in this process. Until that sort of green light is given from the top, it's unlikely that the Russian society will find it in it to some sort of, to try and alter it from the bottom. That is not the way the change in Russia has occurred historically, typically. And that's not where Russia is at the moment. We're actually about to release a big report on the Russian economic adaptation to the war. And so far, things are not great. And you see there is actually a slowdown in many industries. The growth that Russia experienced in the first 3 years of the war is slowing. But nonetheless, it is sustainable. People are getting paid their salaries. And the regime is also able to recruit huge number of volunteers, so-called volunteers, to the war, about 30,000 per month, by paying them very generous compensation. And with this model, despite there's a lot of spending that goes to these needs, this model so far is working out, and hence a lot of people are co-opted just because it's very advantageous for them economically. We have seen the rate of poverty declining in the first couple of years since the start of the war, precisely because this model was beneficial for many people in the bottom of the society. As long as this continues, it's unlikely that we'll see any disagreements and serious frustration with the current status quo.
Okay, so no bottom-up reaction, but how about the elite? I mean, how unified is around this project of the war? So how likely is to have defections or even another new Prigozhin? How likely it is that a fraction of the elite will one day perceive that they stand more to lose from this continuation of the war?
Within the elite base, again, what I've heard talking to people who talk to people, basically at first there was a big shock. If you remember the January 2022, a lot of people near the Kremlin were saying it's ridiculous, Putin will never invade, it's insanity. And in the first months of the war, many found it hard to believe, to adjust to the new reality. We have seen some leaks, including phone conversations of some oligarchs. Many had a lot to lose as a result of the war, the sanctions, right, the disruptions of the economic chains and networks. Indeed, many felt unhappy and disappointed. That's more pro-Western share within the elites. Again, they're not really pro-Western ideologically, but they do depend on the Western connections because of the type of business that they do. And then there's another group represented by Prigozhin. These are hawkish groups who actually support in general what Putin is doing in Ukraine, but they don't think he's doing it right? There's not enough repression, toughness, there's a lot of corruption, and hence basically they want another Stalin. And that's where the disappointment is coming from.
So they think Putin is too soft, in fact.
Yes, to this group, he's too soft. To the other group, he's too hard. So he is like this balance of the interest, trying to find the compromise. But again, as we have seen, this combination of repressions against the rebellion types like Prigozhin, because I think there's zero doubt as to how Prigozhin died in that explosion in the plane. And maybe carrots to those groups that suffered economically from the disruptions. Putin indeed has been compensating many of the businessmen who stayed in Russia through generous redistribution options, offering them, for example, to take over leftover assets by Western companies, all sorts of opportunities in this new emerging economy that are created by sanction circumventions, by a new basically renationalization that's unraveling right now, as we see more and more less loyal businessmen are getting under attack by their persecutors, etc., essentially created a lot of opportunities to get co-opted into the new reality for all the disappointed groups. And over the time, we have seen that the businessmen also, even the more pro-Western businessmen, have eventually adjusted. I'll say that the internationalization right now is unraveling in a lot of ways. So a lot of people who keep neutral say they probably disagree with the war deep inside, but they don't speak up. They found this situation no longer to be sustainable because the Kremlin is going after them, trying to rationalize the assets. So this is the situation that's far from, having fully stabilized. I think this is the moment where the Kremlin realizes neutrality is no longer an option, is a new situation in Russia, where basically Russia is at this all-consuming war against not just Ukraine, but the West more broadly. So we see there's more repressions, they're deepening. But nonetheless, in general, the elites and the adaptation patterns follow the broader patterns that I've described before for the Russian society. It's an unpleasant situation. Many have been left many have lost at the start of the war, but there's little they can change. So that means that they need to adapt. And this adaptation is happening very fast, especially given that there are new opportunities emerging created by the war, especially if you don't have a lot of, moral convictions about certain issues pertaining to this war. It proved to be relatively easy for many people to adjust. And the evidence is the relatively small number of the splits within the elites. In Russia, we see that since the start of the war, only maybe about 5 people try to publicly distance themselves from the regime. It's really a tiny number. The absolute majority have chosen to acquiesce one way or another.
Mm-hmm. So this is a pretty bleak picture, actually. So if the elite is so adjusted after there's been 3 years of war, so the economy has adjusted to the war, society in expectations, as you described, the elite. So how likely it is that after the situation in Ukraine is settled in a way or another, for Putin's whole regime to move against a NATO country, just to continue the project, so to speak?
There are very interesting debates about this topic these days. There are 2 opinions. Basically, one is Putin has never actually attacked a stronger country. That actually has consisted not just for Putin, but all of post-Soviet Russia and the Soviet Union to some extent. Russia tends to go after weaker prey, so to speak. And if you look at its wars, they primarily concentrated in the so-called post-Soviet space, the former Soviet republics areas, since early 1990s, with one notable exception of Syria. So looking at it from historical patterns perspective, it's unlikely that Putin will openly challenge NATO, given that NATO still is significantly stronger than Russia. And if anything, since the start of the war in February 2022, Russian army has proven weaker than many have assumed. So it's really not a conventional threat from the NATO perspective.
Even the Baltic states, which are technically they
exactly
are NATO, but they look very vulnerable and small and post-Soviet in a way.
That's exactly the best question. The question is, how do we define NATO, right? Does Putin think of NATO as this broad alliance that will come to defense of even smaller country like Latvia, for example, using Article 5? Or, as we hear these days, Article 5 is also open to interpretation, right? And that really does not commit all of the countries of NATO to enter the war, essentially, if there is an attack. So if Putin is looking the situation from these lenses, and also if he perceives relative weakening of NATO reinforced by the cracks in the transatlantic that are unfortunately currently already observed, then he may have different temptations, especially given, as we have again seen over the last 20 years, over time he escalates. So the Crimea annexation was more serious than, stronger at the scale than the 2008 war, Russia's war against Georgia, and the 2022 war full-scale war against Ukraine is actually more serious, bigger in scale than the 2014 and 15 war against Ukraine was. So from that perspective, we definitely see the pattern of escalation and Putin's perceived invincibility, right? Because despite all the sanctions and opposition to his actions coming from the West, he still keeps fighting. And as we see, he's not very interested in peace negotiations with Ukraine because he feels like he has an upper hand. He has a winning card on the battlefield. Even if that is questionable, it remains to be seen. So So from that perspective, the perception of the relative weakening of the other side and his own strength may prompt him to escalate more, not of a full-scale aggression against a Baltic country, but perhaps something like a hybrid operation of the type we've seen in Crimea. Suddenly, there are Russian speakers being persecuted in one of the Baltic countries, and Russian green men come to their defenses. That is not unfeasible, especially, warn, if that is coordinated with one of Putin's allies like China. If China simultaneously does something against Taiwan, then indeed the West will be too divided and potentially distracted to act promptly. There's also geographic dimension there, where indeed for Russia, Russia has an advantage in terms of geography in attacking one of the Baltic countries just because of the terrain. So indeed, those are all of the considerations worth keeping in mind. But I will flag one thing. Right now, Russia is really overstretched in Ukraine. This is a highly consuming war of attrition. Russia is already halfway through or more for Soviet stocks, and while it could potentially pull off a small operation, even now militarily, it cannot really commit to anything serious now that all of its resources are being drained and consumed in Ukraine. In some ways, this war in Ukraine is saving NATO from potentially even worse escalation with NATO, and it's kind of frustrating, that some of the politicians are saying sometimes that, this is not the war, given that this is the war that potentially helps safeguard Europe and NATO more broadly from something more, potentially even more serious and catastrophic for existing international security structure as we know it. So Russia is quite drained, and as long as it's basically tied in Ukraine, it's unlikely that it will be able to pull off another serious operation of the scale against NATO. But if there's a freeze, if Russia feels like it won or it has the winning card, it is able to regroup, reconsolidate, and save more of the weapons, accumulate more of the weapons, then potentially such an escalation against hybrid type escalation against one of the NATO countries is not off the table, because the stakes are so high for Putin. This is the war not just against Ukraine, it's the war against the international order led by the West as we know it since the end of the Cold War, and just a tiny operation that will expose NATO weakness, NATO being unable to prove its own member, is potentially quite tempting, because the stakes then will be enormous for Putin. He will be able to prove basically that there is no security structures in Europe as we know it, and hence basically open up the world to new redivision amongst the great powers, which was his goal from the start.
Which means that the most dangerous moment for NATO is when there's some sort of finalization of the fighting in Ukraine.
Exactly, it's a couple of years after, I'd say, maybe a year or two after that is achieved, a ceasefire settlement is achieved. Yes.
Okay, that's another bleak prediction, and I think we should.
Sorry.
Yeah, but I have to thank you very much for being with us, and let's finish here because and hopefully we'll have another discussion when we see more clarity in how the war in Ukraine will end.
Always happy to. Thank you.
Thank you very much.